Good evening, everybody. My name is Russell Goldborn. I'm a professor of French and Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Humanities here at King's. It gives me very great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening. A warm welcome to colleagues, friends and family of Professor Sonia Masai, and a special hello to Sonia's parents, who are, I hope, watching this by video link. I send you my greetings and very best wishes. It's an honour to have with us Professor Susan Bennett from the Department of English at the University of Calgary, to whom I'll be handing over in a moment, so she can say a little bit about Sonia as well. After the lecture, rather than our having questions here, let's have a discussion upstairs in chapters where there'll be drinks and nibbles. Everybody is warmly invited. Before that, I'm delighted to have this opportunity just to say a few words to introduce my colleague who's going to deliver her inaugural lecture, Accented Shakespeare, Professor Sonia Masai from King's English Department. King's English. That is, of course, a Shakespearean coinage. It's the Merry Wives of Windsor that posits the notion of the King's English. Mistress Quickly uses the phrase in relation to her master, the Frenchman, Dr. Caius. Here will be an old abusing of God's patience and the King's English, she says. Of course, by that, she doesn't mean correct usage or what we might think of as received pronunciation. She's referring instead, I think, to common usage, a shared language, the language of the community that populates the play, a play set in Shakespeare's own class and country, of course. And Shakespeare's own interest in the varieties of English, the multiplicity of accents within English, has of course been picked up by scholars in recent years. I'm thinking of people like the linguistician David Crystal and his actor son Ben, who've delighted in helping us hear again the late Elizabethan period London accent, which that sounds like that cross of West Country, Yorkshire and Irish. And that kind of work has helped us to appreciate some of Shakespeare's puns that would otherwise be lost in modern English. I'm thinking of Falstaff's riff on reasons and blackberries, or raisins and blackberries in Henry IV, Part 1. But a whole new branch of research, it seems to me, is focusing not on recovering original pronunciation, but on how performances of Shakespeare since his own day have played a key role in the emergence and evolution of standard English, or what we used to call the King's English, and perhaps what we might in the future call the King's English. This is the research that Professor Sonia Masai has been leading the way in, which she's going to present to us this evening, and which is the subject of her forthcoming book to be published by CUP. Professor Masai is particularly interested in the powerful association between radio Shakespeare, where the voice becomes the defining element of the performance necessarily, the link between that and changing ideals of standard English and Englishness. Those changing ideals, of course, become particularly important when we're dealing with, as Sonia will be, with the world service, when different versions of Shakespeare, different renderings of Shakespeare, different sounds of Shakespeare are projected across the world, and different visions of nationhood are projected across the world. So this is a lecture then that comes from the very heart of King's English Department, and which speaks directly to our festival theme this year, World Service. Professor Masai, too, is at the heart of King's English Department. She's been with us since 2003. She's now Professor of Shakespeare Studies. She previously taught at the Universities of Liverpool, Wolverhampton and Surrey, as well as at Shakespeare's Globe. Professor Masai is one of the world's leading Shakespeare scholars. She's published highly acclaimed critical editions of Titus Andronicus and Edward III. Richard III is next in her sights. Her 2007 CUP monograph, Shakespeare and the Rise of the Editor, is, it seems to me, a landmark work tracing the history, the early history of editorial emendation of Shakespeare's texts through the 16th and 17th centuries. And that book, it seems to me, lay the groundwork for the work that Sonia has gone on to do since, which we see in a series of articles, chapters, edited books, in the appropriations, work in the appropriations and reappropriations of Shakespeare's works throughout the ages and across the world. Sonia, I called Sonia Shakespeare, there's a slip for me. Sonia has worked, amongst other things, on Shakespeare's reception in Italy, though I hasten to add that despite her possible bias, she's not one of that eccentric breed of anti-Stratfordians who suggests that Shakespeare was actually Italian. Scrolla lanza Shakespeare. You're not convinced, good. I think Professor Masai's scholarship is far sounder than that, and I'm sure that Professor Bennett will say more about Sonia's scholarship. I, for one, am very much looking forward to hearing accented Shakespeare this evening. I'll hand you over now to Susan Bennett. Thank you very much.
It's a very real honor and pleasure for me to have this opportunity to introduce Professor Sonia Masai at her inaugural lecture to an audience I suspect that knows her very well as well. Her career in Shakespeare studies has consistently and fully demonstrated all the accomplishments we expect in our faculty at the highest rank. Most prominently, of course, through her books, her edited and co-edited volumes and editions, many chapters in field-defining collections, and essays in peer reviews. She's been diligent and generous in her service here at King's, including 3 years in the role of Vice Dean Education, and she's obviously much sought after by students for supervision of their postgraduate projects. But the best professors, it seems to me, do so much more than build long CVs, and so in these next few minutes, I'd like to illustrate this. I first met Sonia in 2006 in Brisbane, Australia, at the year's World Shakespeare Congress. Before then, I had known her through the previous year's edited collection on worldwide Shakespeares, the introduction to which, more than a decade after its first publication, still remains my go-to for challenging us to think in complicated ways about how Shakespeare is produced, reproduced, and engaged in very many different places in the world, to very different purposes and impacts. Sonia's critical savvy and clarity of thinking in this introduction remains an important and necessary caution against a too easy enthusiasm about what the field likes to call global Shakespeare. But back to Brisbane when we first met. After a lively seminar on local Shakespeares that Sonia had co-curated with MJ Kidney, the three of us were speculating as to why this particular seminar was listed in the program as sponsored by a Brisbane law firm. At this point, a young man, very strangely dressed for an academic, he was in a three-piece suit, white shirt and tie, jumped to his feet and introduced himself as one of the partners in the law firm. He had sponsored this seminar called Local Shakespeares because of his own passion for Shakespeare as an enthusiastic member of a Brisbane amateur dramatic group that put on at least one Shakespeare play every year. He proceeded to tell us, year by year, all the parts he played. Mostly rather minor parts, one has to say. But he assured us that this brought him a great deal more pleasure than his law career. The point of this anecdote is that it makes complete sense to me in the context of Sonia's own career. She has achieved at the highest level academically. Her research is serious, innovative, and often field-leading. But she's also consistently done that thing that too few of us take the time, energy, and effort to do, and she does it with much success. That is, she's willing to engage a more general public with her enthusiasms about Shakespeare and, of course, with her expertise. She's done tremendously important work with Two Gents Productions, the extraordinary Zimbabwean actors based in London, whose Two Gentlemen of Verona was one of the hits of the 2012 Globe to Globe Festival, and with Arnie Pohlmeyer and fellow artists at Rich Mix in Shoreditch. She's been a regular on the BBC, online, on the radio, and on television, as well as having worked with the British Council, the Barbican, and the Hay Festival, among others. It's because, and I'm pretty confident it's only because, Sonia had invited the Flemish director Ivo van Hove to come and talk to King's students long before anyone in the English-speaking world was paying much attention to his theatrical productions, that she and I were able to get Van Hove's support for our volume on his work, a book that will appear from Bloomsbury Methuen next year. As Van Hove said at our first meeting, he said to Sonia quite simply, "I trust you." And trust me, theatre professionals are generally at best rather skeptical about academics who get interested in their work. One of the more memorable demonstrations of this came on BBC Radio's Free Thinking, in a programme on what does global Shakespeare mean? And Sonia was one of 4 participants. After a mad and really rather angry rant by then Shakespeare's Globe artistic director Dominic Dromgoole, who among other things accused academics of not knowing how to read Hamlet, and indeed asserted that academics were out to destroy Shakespeare's popularity and reputation, a rant that left not only the other panelists, but the host, Philip Dodd, speechless, Sonia entered the fray with dignity, clarity, and a graciously able response about why academics have something important, even useful, to contribute. I've played this recording to my graduate students in a seminar on global Shakespeare. And as recently as this spring, a couple of them cheered out loud at the end of her comments. It's this kind of grace and strength in action that makes Sonia such a valued mentor and supervisor. I've met several of her students in the context of our recent collaborative Performance Shakespeare 2016 digital archive, and her students' enthusiasm to work with her and to contribute to projects she leads is palpable. And I've seen firsthand the generosity and care that she takes in that mentorship role. I have always argued that the academic profession is one built on generosity, and that without the commitment of faculty to pay forward all the supports that they themselves have relied on for career progress, without the commitment to be generous with others, and to take it as part of the job, the support, development, and encouragement of young colleagues and of all of our students, the institution simply cannot function, never mind thrive. To be a professor of the highest rank is to embrace those responsibilities and to value them at least as much as individual accomplishments. That's how it should be, and that's certainly the way that Sonia has professed. I'm personally delighted to be here tonight, especially since she and I have had the opportunity to collaborate over the last few years on various research projects. And I'm glad to have the chance on this wonderful occasion to recognize all the kinds of work that Sonia has undertaken. While most of us here will think of scholarly monographs, critical editions, and thought-provoking lectures, I'm sure Bianca and Carla will somehow think about all the other things that she manages to fit into her life. So let us celebrate, too, all the contexts in which Sonia will present tonight. Please welcome Professor Masai.
Well, I'm hugely overwhelmed now. Thank you so much, Russell. Thank you so much, Susan, for such generous introductions. Un ringraziamento speciale a mamma e a papà, Elda e Giulio, che non potevano essere qua stasera. Un bacione, vi voglio bene. You'll be relieved to hear I will not deliver the entire lecture in Italian. So, my lecture falls into 2 parts. I'm going to start by sharing some thoughts about English accents. Having a funny one myself, I thought it'd be really appropriate for my inaugural to put it center stage. So accents, and how they're activated in Shakespearean performance. And then I should focus on Shakespeare-related broadcasting on the BBC World Service. English accents are powerful markers of national and social identity. The standard of what constitutes an accurate or a desirable accent, of course, changes over time. However, the connotations of accents, that is, how accents define speakers, are as powerful today as they've been ever since the word accent acquired its current meaning, which the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, defines as a way of pronouncing a language that is distinctive to a country, area, social class, or individual. The earliest examples in the OED are, of course, from Shakespeare, although cutting remarks about uncouth English accents date as far back as Chaucer. Your accent is something finer than you could purchase in so removed a dwelling, says Orlando to Rosalind in As You Like It, implying that a rural accent is not as clear or as sophisticated as the language spoken at court. National accents are similarly the subject of humorous mockery in Shakespeare. In The Reign of King Edward III, a play now partly attributed to Shakespeare, the king reports how the Countess of Salisbury, besieged by the Scots, imitated their broad speech as an act of defiance. So the Countess imitates the accent as a way of showing a natural superiority over a barbarous enemies. Broad was as derogatory then as it is today, while barbarous is used in its original etymological sense of not Latin, nor Greek, and therefore pertaining to those outside the Roman Empire, hence uncivilized and uncultured. Accents are especially significant in relation to Shakespeare because of the role that Shakespeare, the national poet, has played in the establishment of a standard English pronunciation since the mid-18th century, when those who championed a revival of Shakespeare on stage also advocated the need for a supra-regional and localized standard of pronunciation for all. A good example is Thomas Sheridan, the father of Richard Sheridan, and the author of one of the earliest dictionaries of English standard pronunciation, who also ensured the regular programming of Shakespeare's plays while he was a stage manager at the Smoke Alley Theatre in Dublin between the mid-1740s and the mid-1750s. The accent most readily associated with correctness and distinction since then, and later known as received pronunciation, has recently started to decline and is now even acquiring negative connotations of snobbishness and elitism. However, the use of anything but an educated Southern accent is still problematic when deployed on the Shakespearean stage. Even in the 1960s, when new voices were starting to emerge in the writing of post-war playwrights, most actors were well-versed in what Carol Rutter calls verbal camouflage. Albert Finney, Tom Courtenay, Peter O'Toole, Anthony Hopkins, Alan Bates were effectively bilingual because, as Rutter explains, they were trained not to use the regional inflected accent on stage. When exceptionally used on the Shakespearean stage, regional accents caused outrage. Most memorably, Nico Williamson, who was born in Scotland and raised in the Midlands, used his regional accent to play Hamlet in Tony Richardson's production at the Roundhouse in 1968. In this production, he presented a disaffected prince as a radicalized intellectual, thus echoing the social movements and student protests that were sweeping across Europe and the United States at the time. Reviewer John Simon found Williamson's accent utterly inappropriate for the role. In his review, My Throat is in the Midlands, Simon first remarked on the acoustic quality of Williamson's voice. Williamson has a tendency to sound like an electric guitar, and his lips seem to part only for visual effect. Then he turns to the accent. It has been called Midlands, North Country, and Cockney with a loose overlay of culture. Only Harry Higgins could correctly place it south of the Beatles and north of the Stones, and identify the veneer of as grammar or council school. But even Colonel Pickering could tell that it isn't Hamlet. A little concession to modernization still leads to the foregone conclusion that surely Jimmy Porter or Bill Maitland or some other Osbornian professional griper is no conscionable correspondence for the exacting idealist turned cosmic malcontent. From commenting on the accent, Simon finishes off by disparaging his equine head his gangling, skulking body, and his legs, which he claimed, if not exactly spindly, seemed to him obstreperously lower class. Lower class legs. Simon's review seems now acerbic and backward-looking, conjuring uncomfortable memories of earlier biological determinism and their tragic racial and ethnic applications into the 20th century. However, Simon's appraisal of the acoustic qualities of Williamson's voice were in fact perfectly in keeping with contemporary views on the relative prestige value of regional accents. In his influential 1970 study on evaluative reactions to accent, social psychologist Howard Giles did not only confirm the regional accents had less prestige value than RP, but he also suggested that regional accents themselves, rather than attitudes to them, ought to be fixed. This is Giles. Regional accent is a social stigma, and therefore two courses of action may be put forward to remedy this situation. One, we could attempt to change people's attitudes away from one of social prejudice for non-standard accented speech. Or we could attempt to teach children competence in a standard accent to such a degree that at least they are able to produce this form in socially appropriate situations. Guess which one is going to go for? This latter objective would seem the more efficient method of dispelling the particular social prejudice involved for any significant length of time, and in this way therapy is related to the cause of the problem rather than its symptoms. So regional accents are the problem. Attitudes to them are just a symptom. Williamsons Hamlet is now regarded as a milestone in the recent history of the reception of the play on stage. Current assessments of this production suggest the extent to which attitudes to non-standard accents have changed since then. Representative of the increasing open-mindedness towards marked voices in Shakespearean performance is Samuel Kroll's recent analysis of the film version of the stage production. And this is Kroll. The use of Williamson's native accent, he argues, was one of the film's most exciting features. The very sound of his voice, as he adds, made Williamson's prince come across as decidedly anti-establishment, brimming with the cheeky, cocky wit of the early John Lennon, suggesting that Liverpool was closer to his domain than Whitehall. The stark contrast between Simon, who was writing in the late 1960s, and Kroll, who was writing in the mid-2010s, shows not only how accent, but also cultural connotations of accents change over a relatively short period of time, especially when compared to slower and more gradual morphological and syntactical language mutations. But attitudes to regional and foreign accents in Shakespearean contemporary performance are not uniformly tolerant and accepting. In 2011, in an otherwise generous review of Roxana Silbert's RSC production of Measure for Measure, Ian Shuttleworth critiqued Jodie McNee's Isabella for sounding impassioned, and then he adds, Liverpudlian, and for lacking much of either the religious or the sexual magnetism required by the role. So I think it's fair to say there is a lingering prejudice against marked voices in Shakespearean performance. But there's also a veritable sea change that is taking place, with directors increasingly using non-conventional accents to inflect the interpretation of the fictive world of the play. And you may have been lucky enough to hear Rory Kinnear shed his impeccable standard accent to play Iago in broad estuary English next to Adrian Lester's Othello at the National in 2013. In this production, class rather than race was the marker of social exclusion, and Iago rather than Othello was the marginalized outsider. Or you may have heard Hugh Corsi and Lucian Samati play Othello and Iago in Iqbal Khan's production for the RSC in 2015. Samati's younger and less assimilated Iago spoke in his native Tanzanian accent, while Corsi, who performed the lead role in impeccable standard pronunciation, cut a striking figure as a successful general and a more integrated member of the Venetian elite. So this production transformed Iago's original racially inflected prejudice against the Moor into a spine-chilling exploration of intra-racial tensions. These two recent Otellos are just two examples of how an increasing number of productions have been breaking new ground by combining unconventional casting strategies with a curatorial approach to voice, finally. As you may have gathered by now, I'm very busy trying to remedy the fact that while unconventional casting in terms of gender and race has attracted, and quite rightly so, quite a lot of attention, accents haven't. So I'm going to use the historical perspective that I've gained from studying the history of accents in Shakespearean performance to discuss a few examples of radio Shakespeare and to show you how the World Service has not only reinforced but also challenged the way in which we all think Shakespeare should sound when performed on stage or on the radio. So, on to part 2 of my lecture. A colleague, fellow scholar, Suzanne, who might be here tonight or might be not, I'm not sure. She's highlighted a very special connection between Shakespeare and radio broadcasting, which I find absolutely kind of foundational to my way of thinking about Shakespeare on the BBC World Service as well. So just a few quotes from my work first. From the very early days of radio, emerging stations and networks seized upon Shakespearean performances both as guarantees of quality content and respectability, and as a means of enriching a sense of occasion and celebration as their own institutional milestones were achieved. And then she goes on to say that there is a still flourishing self-association of public service BBC and Shakespeare at home and abroad, and then she reminds us of the key role played by the BBC in consolidating that well-established notion that Shakespeare is a form of ghostly linguistic possession which comes to embody the English language itself. So almost a symbiosis between radio, the history of radio, and the development of Shakespeare, parallel, I think, in many ways between performance and theatre performance and radio. At times of crisis, Shakespeare did indeed come to embody not only the English language, but also a powerful sense of national identity, which is especially prominent when the World Service reaches out to English-speaking audiences worldwide. So my first audio recording was originally broadcast by the World Service on Shakespeare's birthday on 23rd of April, 1942. And it includes extracts from As You Like It, Henry IV, and Henry V. These extracts were introduced and performed by Peggy Ashcroft, Robert Donat, Edith Evans, and Ralph Richardson. By April 1942, England had witnessed multiple Nazi invasions on the continent and had been exposed to large-scale seaborne and airborne attacks. Despite a British victory in the Battle of Britain, the Blitz continued and Germany had yet to suffer its first major defeat. So a time of crisis. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that the first extract should focus on the green world of the Forest of Arden, when the young were carefree and could afford to spend their time growing up and falling in love with each other. Similarly, the second extract reminded listeners of the warm and rumbustious world of the Boar's Head Tavern in Eastcheap, where Prince Hal and Falstaff, royalty and commoners, come together to eat, drink, and waste their time in idleness. The third extract, which I'm going to play for you in a minute, is instead a call to arms. The extract from Henry V, once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, is followed by hurrying references to the war and to the need to fight it, not only by air or at sea, but by playing Shakespeare in London and in hundreds of other towns across England, in factories, hospitals, military camps, and mining villages, in order to ensure that Shakespeare's vision for England, darkened by the war, will shine brilliant and unclouded again. And here's the extract.
Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more. or close the wall up with our English dead. In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility. But when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger, stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favored rage. Then lend the eye a terrible aspect. Let it fly through the portage of the head like the brass cannon. Let the brow o'erwhelm it as fearfully as doth a gored rock, or hang and jutty his confounded base, swilled with the wild and wasteful ocean. Now set the teeth and stretch the nostril wide. Hold hard the breath and bend up every spirit to its full height. On, you noble English, whose blood is fed from fathers of warproof, fathers that, like so many Alexanders, have in these parts from morn till even fought, and sheathed their swords for lack of argument. Dishonor not your mothers, now attest that those whom you called fathers did beget you. Be copy now to men of grosser blood, and teach them how to war. And you, good yeomen, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding, which I doubt not, for there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, strained upon the start. Again the foot, follow your spirit, and upon this charge, cry God for Harry, England, and St. George!
That is the third vision of England. Her kings and her battles, victories and defeats. England in crisis, small, but great in her tradition of liberty. But again the figures waver and fade. The vision in the mirror passes, the glass is cold and steely. Once more we are only the players.
Richard Burbage,
Sarah Siddons,
Edmund Kean, Frank Benson, Beerbohm Tree, Henry Early.
Ellen Kent.
We are the players. We were your servants at the Globe, and it stood like a wooden urn in the fields on Bankside. We played Shakespeare there for you.
For the Groundlings who stood in the yards, for the gallants and citizens who paid to sit on the stage. And we played and the sun was blue and beat down upon us.
We are the players. We were your servants at Drury Lane. We played Shakespeare there for you. For the orange girls and the masked beauties. For the wits and exquisites who sat in the boxes. And as we played, our shadows flickered behind us in the unsteady light of the sconces.
We are the players. We were your servants at the Lyceum. We played Shakespeare there for you.
The feathers and buses, the lorgnettes and manacles, the top hats and moustaches. We spoke about the soft hissing of gas. There was a faint smell of gas in the air, and we moved in the yellow haze of gaslight.
We are the players. We were your servants at the Old Vic. We played Shakespeare there for you. For the student and the worker, for the shop girl and the office clerk, for the coster and the banker.
Our eyes are darkened by war and the glass is cloudy, but we are still playing Shakespeare in London, in Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, and 100 other towns, in hospitals and factories, in military camps and mining villages.
For Shakespeare had a shining and a clear vision of England, and we will go on until his vision is reality, until the glass is clear again and clean. The boards we have trod for centuries will be scrubbed white and new. The footlights will cast bright shadows, and the vision of Shakespeare will shine brilliant and unclouded.
I hope you enjoyed that. I found it quite extraordinary when I first heard it, quite moving, but also really interesting. I found the delivery striking. What seemed most interesting to me is that the clipped, precise, formal, high-sounding diction parallels the prowess of Henry's and Churchill's soldiers. Vocal decorum and military competence are linked to true breeding. If the limbs of Henry's soldiers are made in England, the actors themselves identify as members of Shakespeare's original company. They claim to be the very actors who were at Will Shakespeare's elbow and who delivered his lines in the sunshine at the Globe on Bankside. They also claim to be the actors who played Shakespeare in the flickering light of the candles and oil lamps in Drury Lane, or against the soft hissing of the gaslights at the Lyceum. their voices carried by radio waves across the world by a medium that transforms performance into a theatre of the mind, span not only across space but also across time, in order to revive the true ideal of Englishness that in 1942 the actors identify with Shakespeare's vision for England. But radio produces sounds rather than visions, and it is the voice that is charged with the daunting task of evoking an ideal for which many had died and many more were going to continue to fight. It is the paradoxical claim, the actors' claim to acoustic authenticity, which I find particularly fascinating, because it is, of course, a convenient fiction. Shakespeare's actors did not sound anything like they did. As historical phonologists like David Crystal have recently reminded us. And not only because standards of English pronunciation have changed, but also because of the changing status accorded to Shakespeare and to play acting more generally in the early modern period. As I mentioned earlier, the association between Shakespeare and standard English pronunciation dates back to the mid-18th century, does not apply to the early modern period when actors and play acting were deemed low status, if not positively disreputable. Shakespeare's theatre, the first instance of mass entertainment in London, proved notoriously controversial. Those who defended the stage also praised it for elevating the literary status of the English language. Most famously, Thomas Heywood, observed in his Apology for Actors, "Our English tongue, which has been the most harsh, uneven, and broken language of the world, part Dutch, part Irish, Saxon, Scotch, Welsh, and indeed a gallimaufry of many, but perfect in none, is now by this secondary means of playing continually refined, every writer striving himself to add a new flourish unto it, and so that in process, from the most rude and unpolished tongue, it is grown to a most perfect and composed language, and many excellent works and elaborate poems written in the same, that many nations grow enamored of our tongue." Detractors of the theatre, on the other hand, found the elevated register used by actors on stage as offensive as, if not more offensive than the obscene language used by the actors on stage, which was the ostensible target of their invectives. So the deployment of what Shakespeare contemporaries sometimes refer to as usual speech, an emerging standard of pronunciation associated with the court, made the actors sound not only other than themselves, but also socially above the lowly status accorded to their profession. As Stephen Gosson explains in plays confuted in 5 actions, action, pronunciation, apparel, agility, music, severally considered are the good blessings of God. Nothing hurtful in their own nature, yet being bound up together in a bundle to set up the pomp, the plays, the inventions of the devil that will carry that brand on their back to make them known, which the devil clapped on at the first beginning, that is, idolatry. Gosson's invective against play acting crucially includes pronunciation, because he sees pronunciation as a way of declaring ourselves by words and by gestures to be otherwise than we are. Hence the charge of idolatry, of forging illusions that threaten the absolute self-possession of the real thing. So when Shakespeare's actors spoke in an elevated register, they did not only sound different from Ashcroft and Richardson, but they did so in breach of acceptable standards of acoustic social decorum. So the appeal you've just heard to a shared sense of national identity and collective responsibility that the actors claim dates back to Shakespeare's time and resounds unchanged across time and space is in fact, from a strictly philological perspective, a fiction. It's a moving and a useful fiction, but a fiction, nevertheless. Moving on to my second recording, we jump forward from 1942 to the 1960s, when the specific brand of acoustic decorum you have just heard was being challenged by actors like Nicole Williamson. The 1960s also witnessed a slow but steady rise in the number of foreign productions of Shakespeare on the English stage, as Britain was backing out from its remaining colonies. Radio had interestingly anticipated the stage in setting a precedent for foreign Shakespeare broadcasting. Back in the 1940s, when broadcasts started to be made in all major European languages, and as a result of that, the service, originally called the BBC Empire Service, was renamed the BBC Overseas Service. In 1964, the General Overseas Service, which I'm going to abbreviate from now on as GOS, marked the quarter-centenary of Shakespeare's birth by broadcasting several Shakespeare-related programs, and some of them included extracts from Shakespeare's best-known plays performed in a surprisingly wide range of world languages. However, most programs showcase primarily recognizably English forms of Shakespearean performance. The feature article in the April issue of London Calling, the BBC External Services magazine, makes a passing concession to the international quality of Shakespeare's legacy, but it also forecloses any serious engagement with foreign Shakespeare by pointing out that, right at the top, the impression which the works of Shakespeare has made upon countries of widely different peoples, cultures, and traditions would be very hard to assess. So the potential significance of foreign Shakespeare is acknowledged, but it is still, at this point in time, it is still regarded as remote, alien, impenetrable, hard to assess. So the emphasis of the celebrations shifts back onto better-known territory. Programs will focus firmly on drama and literature and other higher arts upon which Shakespeare's thought has brushed off. Accordingly, the programs advertised by the GOS in the main feature of the London Calling in April '64 are The Best of Shakespeare, a series of 26 weekly programs designed as an anthology of the best beloved speeches and scenes from 19 plays. What Shakespeare Meant to Me, a series of interviews with well-known public figures, including a very young Vanessa Redgrave, who spoke on it and performed by Peggy Ashcroft, Robert Donat, Edith Evans, and Ralph Richardson. By April 1942, England had witnessed multiple Nazi invasions on the continent and had been exposed to large-scale seaborne and airborne attacks. Despite a British victory in the Battle of Britain, the Blitz continued and Germany had yet to suffer its first major defeat. So a time of crisis. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that the first extract should focus on the green world of the Forest of Arden, when the young were carefree and could afford to spend their time growing up and falling in love with each other. Similarly, the second extract reminded listeners of the warm and rumbustious world of the Boar's Head Tavern in Eastcheap, where Prince Hal and Falstaff, royalty and commoners, come together to eat, drink, and waste their time in idleness. The third extract, which I'm going to play for you in a minute, is instead a call to arms. The extract from Henry V, Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, is followed by hurrying references to the war and to the need to fight it, not only by air or at sea, but by playing Shakespeare in London and in hundreds of other towns across England, in factories, hospitals, military camps, and mining villages, in order to ensure that Shakespeare's vision for England, darkened by the war, will shine brilliant and unclouded again. And here's the extract.
Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, or close the wall up with our English dead. In peace there's nothing so becomes a man as modest stillness and humility, but when the blast of war blows in our ears, then imitate the action of the tiger, stiffen the sinews, summon up the blood, disguise fair nature with hard-favored rage. Then lend the eye a terrible aspect, let it fly through the portage of the head like the brass cannon. Let the brow o'erwhelm it as fearfully as doth a gored rock, or hang and jutty his confounded base, swilled with the wild and wasteful ocean. Now set the teeth and stretch the nostril wide, hold hard the breath, and bend up every spirit to its full height. On, you noble English, whose blood is fed from fathers of warproof, fathers that, like so many Alexanders, have in these parts from morn till even fought, and sheathed their swords for lack of argument. Dishonor not your mothers, Now attest that those whom you called fathers did beget you. Be copy now to men of grosser blood, and teach them how to war. And you, good yeomen, whose limbs were made in England, show us here the mettle of your pasture. Let us swear that you are worth your breeding, which I doubt not, for there is none of you so mean and base that hath not noble lustre in your eyes. I see you stand like greyhounds in the slips, strained upon the start. Again the foot, follow your spirit, and upon this charge, cry God for Harry, England, and St. George!
That is the third vision of England. Her kings and her battles, victories and defeats. England in crisis, small, but great in her tradition of liberty. But again the figures waver and fade. The vision in the mirror passes, the glass is cold and steely. Once more we are only the players.
Richard Burbage,
Sarah Sidney,
Edmund Kean,
Frank Benson,
Beerbohm Tree,
Henry Early.
Ellen Kent.
We are the players. We were your servants at the Globe, and it stood like a wooden urn in the fields on Bankside. We played Shakespeare there for you.
for the Groundlings who stood in the yards, for the gallants and citizens who paid to sit on the stage. And we played and the sun was blue and beat down upon us.
We are the players. We were your servants at Drury Lane. We played Shakespeare there for you. For the orange girls and the masked beauties. For the wits and exquisites who sat in the boxes. And as we played, our shadows flickered behind us in the unsteady light of the sconces.
We are the players. We were your servants at the Lyceum. We played Shakespeare there for you.
The feathers and bustles, the lorgnettes and manacles, the top hats and moustaches. We spoke about the soft hissing of gas. There was a faint smell of gas in the air, and we moved in the yellow haze of gaslight.
We are the players. We were your servants at the Old Vic. We played Shakespeare there for you. For the student and the worker, for the shop girl and the office clerk, for the coster and the banker.
Our eyes are darkened by war and the glass is cloudy, but we are still playing Shakespeare in London, in Birmingham, Liverpool, Manchester, and 100 other towns, in hospitals and factories, in military camps and mining villages.
For Shakespeare had a shining and a clear vision of England. And we will go on until his vision is reality, until the glass is clear again and clean. The boards we have trod for centuries will be scrubbed white and new. The footlights will cast bright shadows, and the vision of Shakespeare will shine brilliant and unclouded.
I hope you enjoy that. I found it quite extraordinary when I first heard it, quite moving, but also really interesting. I found the delivery striking. What seemed most interesting to me is that the clipped, precise, formal, high-sounding diction parallels the prowess of Henry's and Churchill's soldiers. Vocal decorum and military competence are linked to true breeding. If the limbs of Henry's soldiers are made in England, the actors themselves identify as members of Shakespeare's original company. They claim to be the very actors who were at Will Shakespeare's elbow and who delivered his lines in the sunshine at the Globe on Bankside. They also claim to be the actors who played Shakespeare in the flickering light of the candles and oil lamps in Drury Lane, or against the soft hissing of the gaslights at the Lyceum. Their voices, carried by radio waves across the world by a medium that transforms performance into a theatre of the mind, span not only across space but also across time, in order to revive the true ideal of Englishness that in 1942 the actors identify with Shakespeare's vision for England. But radio produces sounds rather than visions, and it is the voice that is charged with the daunting task of evoking an ideal for which many had died and many more were going to continue to fight. It is the paradoxical claim, the actors' claim to acoustic authenticity, which I find particularly fascinating, because it is, of course, a convenient fiction. Shakespeare's actors did not sound anything like they did. As historical phonologists like David Crystal have recently reminded us. And not only because standards of English pronunciation have changed, but also because of the changing status accorded to Shakespeare and to play acting more generally in the early modern period. As I mentioned earlier, the association between Shakespeare and standard English pronunciation dates back to the mid-18th century, does not apply to the early modern period when actors in play acting were deemed low status, if not positively disreputable. Shakespeare's theatre, the first instance of mass entertainment in London, proved notoriously controversial. Those who defended the stage also praised it for elevating the literary status of the English language. Most famously, Thomas Heywood, observed in his Apology for Actors, "Our English tongue, which has been the most harsh, uneven, and broken language of the world, part Dutch, part Irish, Saxon, Scotch, Welsh, and indeed a gallimaufry of many, but perfect in none, is now by this secondary means of playing continually refined, every writer striving himself to add a new flourish unto it, and so that in process, from the most rude and unpolished tongue, it is grown to a most perfect and composed language, and many excellent works and elaborate poems written in the same, that many nations grow enamored of our tongue." Detractors of the theatre, on the other hand, found the elevated register used by actors on stage as offensive as, if not more offensive than the obscene language used by the actors on stage, which was the ostensible target of their invectives. So the deployment of what Shakespeare contemporaries sometimes refer to as usual speech, an emerging standard of pronunciation associated with the court, made the actors sound not only other than themselves, but also socially above the lowly status accorded to their profession. As Stephen Gosson explains in plays confuted in 5 actions, action, pronunciation, apparel, agility, music, severally considered are the good blessings of God. Nothing hurtful in their own nature, yet being bound up together in a bundle to set up the pomp, the plays, the inventions of the devil, they will carry that brand on their back to make them known, which the devil clapped on at the first beginning, that is, idolatry. Gosson's invective against play acting crucially includes pronunciation, because he sees pronunciation as a way of declaring ourselves by words and by gestures to be otherwise than we are. Hence the charge of idolatry, of forging illusions that threaten the absolute self-possession of the real thing. So when Shakespeare's actors spoke in an elevated register, they did not only sound different from Ashcroft and Richardson, but they did so in breach of acceptable standards of acoustic social decorum. So the appeal you've just heard to a shared sense of national identity and collective responsibility that the actors claim dates back to Shakespeare's time and resounds unchanged across time and space is in fact, from a strictly philological perspective, a fiction. It's a moving and a useful fiction, but a fiction nevertheless. Moving on to my second recording, we jump forward from 1942 to the 1960s, when the specific brand of acoustic decorum you have just heard was being challenged by actors like Nicole Williamson. The 1960s also witnessed a slow but steady rise in the number of foreign productions of Shakespeare on the English stage, as Britain was backing out from its remaining colonies. Radio had interestingly anticipated the stage in setting a precedent for foreign Shakespeare broadcasting. Back in the 1940s, when broadcasts started to be made in all major European languages, and as a result of that, the service, originally called the BBC Empire Service, was renamed the BBC Overseas Service. In 1964, the General Overseas Service, which I'm going to abbreviate from now on as GOS, marked the quarter centenary of Shakespeare's birth by broadcasting several Shakespeare-related programs, and some of them included extracts from Shakespeare's best-known plays performed in a surprisingly wide range of world languages. However, most programs showcase primarily recognizably English forms of Shakespearean performance. The feature article in the April issue of London Calling, the BBC External Services magazine, makes a passing concession to the international quality of Shakespeare's legacy, but it also forecloses any serious engagement with foreign Shakespeare by pointing out that, right at the top, the impression which the works of Shakespeare has made upon countries of widely different peoples, cultures, and traditions will be very hard to assess. So the potential significance of foreign Shakespeare is acknowledged, but it is still, at this point in time, it is still regarded as remote, alien, impenetrable, hard to assess. So the emphasis of the celebrations shifts back onto better-known territory. Programs will focus firmly on drama and literature and other higher arts upon which Shakespeare's thought has brushed off. Accordingly, the programs advertised by the GOS in the main feature of the London Calling in April '64 are The Best of Shakespeare, a series of 26 weekly programs designed as an anthology of the best beloved speeches and scenes from 19 plays. What Shakespeare Meant to Me, a series of interviews with well-known public figures, including a very young Vanessa Redgrave, who spoke on 11th of April 1964, and then Shakespeare music, as well as a few one-off programs, mostly broadcast from Stratford, or about the RSC, which had only recently received its royal incorporation. Only later in the year, on 20th of October 1964, the GOS broadcast Such Sweet Thunder, a program entirely devoted to extracts from the plays in 21 languages, accompanied by music by Duke Ellington. Much harder to track down in the BBC archive and database are programs broadcast in 1964 by foreign language services within the GOS. Exceptionally, the magazine London Calling advertised the broadcast by the African service of a Swahili Julius Caesar, no doubt due to the newsworthy quality attached to his translator, Julius Nyerere, who had just become the first president of Tanzania, of post-independence Tanzania. My second recording is taken from another program called Shakespeare, Poet of the World. This program was originally broadcast by the African Service on the 19th of April, '64, but did not feature in London Calling. I was only able to find it because the BBC last year decided to mark another important anniversary, the quartercentenary of the death, by compiling a database of all programs that contain an extract or a reference or a radio play by Shakespeare. It was only through going through this database that I came across this program, and I chose two extracts from this program because they seem to me symptomatic of a fairly widespread tension at the time between the wish to show how Shakespeare elevates and improves other cultures and languages and the need to contain the exotic sound of all the foreign voices and accents through which Shakespeare was increasingly being played on the world stage by reasserting the ultimate and fundamental Englishness of Shakespeare as national poet. So the first extract is a short excerpt from Nyerere's Julius Caesar, which was replayed in this program. It's only a very short extract drawn from Antony's speech in the Forum, starting, "But yesterday, the word of Caesar might have stood against the world. Now he lies there." There's only a few lines, so I'm going to play this extract first.
Ni jana tu neno moja la Caesar lingaliweza kutikisa dunia. Sasa amelala pale na hapana hata fukara mmoja kumstaki. Mabwana, kama mimi ningependa kuitia mioyo na vichwa vyenu machafuko na ghadhabu, basi ningewakosea Brutus na Catesby, ambao wote mwajua ni watu waheshimiwa. Wao sitawakosea. Ni heri niwakosee marehemu na mwenyewe na ninyi niwakosee kuliko kuwakosea watu kufu kama hao.
And now I'm going to play for you the extract that followed straight after. the Swahili Julius Caesar, and I'm not going to tell you what it is, because I would spoil it for you, because it's such a strange and bizarre non sequitur. So I'm just going to play it for you.
I'll begin and then we'll help the others later. This room was the living room of the Shakespeare family home. You'll see the kitchen, that's the room beyond, last of all. 3 bedrooms upstairs. It is the front one, which is directly above here, where William was born. William's father, John Shakespeare, made leather gloves and dealt in wool for a living. So all on that side, when you go through the opening on my right, was the glove shop and wool shop and storeroom and workroom. His father, apart from being quite a prosperous businessman, did become High Bailiff of Stratford-upon-Avon, which is equivalent to Mayor of the town. You'll find the museum side very carefully labelled. The downstairs one covers the history of both these houses over the years, and the upstairs one refers to William himself. There is a very priceless exhibit upstairs, being the first folio. That was printed in 1623, the first collected edition of Shakespeare's plays. Now, I think that just covers the main points, and we do need you to have a look around on your own. Should you have any questions, don't hesitate to come along, because we are only too pleased to help you at any time. All right?
This extract followed straight after the Swahili Julius Caesar and before other extracts from the plays. And I found it so bizarre when I listened to this program that I thought I'd double check if it was actually broadcast in that order. So I was able, thanks to wonderful Louise North, an archivist at the BBC British Archives Centre in Caversham, these PSB, this program is broadcast, and indeed it's there. And if it's there, it means that that's pretty much what we can assume happened. So I was obviously really, really intrigued. I thought the propriety of the guide's accent and their location at the birthplace, the one and only point of origin of Shakespeare the man, cannot but come across after the Swahili as an abrupt U-turn or return to land, blood, and language as traditional markers of national identity. After the Swahili translation had powerfully evoked the political struggle towards a radical regime change, from the decline of the Roman Republic to the rise of the empire in the play, from colonial administration to independence in 1960s Tanzania. What seems interesting to me once again is the combination of a genuine curiosity to hear Shakespeare spoken in accents yet unknown and the need to re-establish or reassert the differences instead of the continuities between English and foreign Shakespeare. It would, however, be unfair to judge the offerings of the GOS and its foreign services entirely from our own historical perspective. In the context of the mid-1960s, these offerings were pioneering and more progressive than the way in which foreign Shakespeare was being performed on stage. And a good example of that is the RSC World Theatre Seasons at the Aldwych, just across the street. Despite launching to mark the quarter centenary of Shakespeare's birth in 1964, the seasons included precious little international Shakespeare, and probably deliberately so, since, as Robert Shaughnessy has explained, the rationale was the showcasing of other indigenous theatrical traditions, and therefore not Shakespeare, which was clearly still regarded primarily as indigenous to these isles and not as a global playwright, as it was increasingly going to be the case from the 1990s, early 2000s onwards. The first non-English Shakespearean production to be included in the World Theatre Seasons was Welcome Somi's Umabata, a Zulu version of Macbeth. The production met with great popular acclaim during its 3-week run, a long run in 1972, but its presentation suffered from the concerted attempt to insulate its London audiences from the sound of the Zulu translation. As Mervyn McMurtry reports, a simultaneous interpretation was delivered by Huntley Stewart, a Zulu linguist, via earphone, drowning out the sound on Somi Sul's translation. Had audiences been exposed to the translation, they may have appreciated how, as McMurtry notes, certain Zulu idiomatic expressions and conventions had been effectively integrated with the Shakespearean text. So this moment in time, 1964, struck me, if you look at radio, but also if you look at theatre and the stage, it struck me as really interesting with this attempt to almost insulate the audience from the sound of Shakespeare without his language. Or at the very least, combined with the curiosity of listening to Shakespeare in other languages, the need to give the audience a term of comparison within which to measure the distance between the familiar and the exotic, between Shakespeare the national poet, which still was very much, and Shakespeare the global playwright, which wasn't quite yet. My third and final recording. We move up to our own time. I have selected this third recording because it showcases, I think, what epitomizes performance and radio very much, so the kind of Shakespeare broadcast by the BBC World Service. And I decided to play it for you because I find that increasingly marked voices, as I was saying right at the beginning of the lecture, are starting to question and deconstruct that very distinction between English and foreign Shakespeare that was still firmly in place in 1964. The World Service, of course, continues to broadcast the best of English Shakespeare, and why shouldn't they? A notable example is a 2-hour production of King Lear, broadcast on 23rd of December 2006 and recorded 2 months earlier live at the Globe here in London. According to Yves-Marie Oesterlen, the broadcast had an anticipated audience of 42 million listeners, the largest single audience for any Shakespearean productions to date. However, the World Service is also contributing to resetting the cultural agenda and to querying the logic that informs mega events like the King Lear broadcast, which are still presenting English Shakespeare to the rest of the world as a preeminently British export. In keeping with and building on the instinct that had led programmers and producers in 1964 to broadcast programs like Shakespeare, Poet of the World, the World Service also now offers a platform for artists who bring different languages, cultures, and theatrical traditions to Shakespeare, changing not only how Shakespeare productions look on stage, but also how Shakespeare is expected to sound, both on stage and on the airwaves. So my third recording was originally broadcast as part of the Strand programme on the World Service in November 2008. In this extract, Zimbabwean actor Tonderai Munievo talks about his reasons for wanting to perform Shakespeare in English, in London, but in his own way, in the Zimbabwean way. You will also hear theatre director Arne Paul Meyer, who was German by birth, but was raised in Cameroon and started directing in South Africa before moving to London. The recording includes a short extract from the framing device that opened their production of The Two Gentlemen of Verona at the Oval House Theatre earlier in 2008. The framing device was played by Tonderai Munievo and Dento Chikura and is followed by a short interview.
We begin with a Zimbabwean take on Shakespeare. It couldn't be more timely, really, as health officials struggle to cope with a cholera epidemic that's killed hundreds, if not thousands. The pressure is on Zimbabwe's rival leaders meeting in South Africa this week to resolve the country's political crisis caused by disputed elections before the country collapses altogether. So how do Zimbabweans living in exile abroad express how they feel about what's going on? Vakamana Vaviri ve Zimbabwe is a new play staged by 2 Zimbabwean actors living in London. It's an adaptation of Shakespeare's comedy, The Two Gentlemen of Verona. The action, relationship and betrayals of 2 men, Valentine and Proteus, transferred from 17th century Italy to modern-day Zimbabwe, where 2 taxi drivers begin arguing over a fare.
Madam, come with me. Your driver, say Eglamo, forward ever, backward never. 50 pounds, chetty.
Masikana mbeduka. Tukandisa Milani.
Why are you speaking to our guests in Shona? Can't you see they are whites? So forgive him, madam. He grew up in the bush. I speak proper English.
No, you don't.
I speak Shakespearean English. William Shakespeare was my grandfather.
No, he wasn't.
And indeed he does. Well, Shakespeare's original play tackled themes of alienation, exile and power struggle. Themes that resonate with the Zimbabwean experience today, as the director, Anna Polmeyer, and actor Tundarai Munyevu told me when they came in to see us.
We thought we wanted to have something that represented Zimbabwe in a way to us, as a way of introducing the audience to the story, really, so that it sets you up so you know immediately that you're dealing with a Zimbabwean situation, you're dealing with Zimbabwean characters and characteristics. So, a lot of the charm that the taxi drivers have and the sort of exuberance and in-your-face attitude that they have, we really wanted to reflect that within the work.
Oh no, what about thematically? I mean, it's a play about love, friendship, betrayal, but also, I suppose on many levels, displacement. Is that part of the Zimbabwean experience too? Is that why this play works so well?
Well, I think that was a discovery very early on in rehearsals, where we started playing around with the play, and we realized that what resonated with us, and also resulting out of those improvisations in Shona, we were like, well, actually, these people start behaving differently when they're in a new place. So Proteus only becomes so deceitful or false to his friend when he's moved from Verona to Milan. So yes, it's about friendship and betrayal, but what are the reasons for that betrayal? And what resonated with us was that notion of you come into an entirely new cultural environment, and that changes you, or that sort of allows other aspects of your personality to come to the fore. And so yeah, that's where we sort of pointed our finger and said, that's interesting, because that resonates with our experiences of migration, of displacement, of cultural otherness.
Tondra, you're nodding in agreement there.
Absolutely. I mean, it happens in sort of in different ways for different people, obviously. But when you do move to a new country, you have to really sort of leave something behind. And what I like playing Proteus in this play is that you have him sort of slowly, bit by bit, sort of forgetting himself. Actually, he knows that he's doing it, but he starts behaving in a way that's not particularly true to himself. And then the very last scene, you have him reconciled with who he was before and what he could be as a person. And I think as a Zimbabwean person living in exile, you feel that there's a certain amount you have to leave behind, and then you carry on. And for me as an actor, actually getting to a point of being a Zimbabwean actor and acting in Zimbabwean plays was the point of reconciliation for me.
Well, you're certainly a powerful actor. You and your colleague Denton, I mean, you take on, 15 roles in this play?
And a dog.
Tonderai's and Arne's comments speak eloquently and for themselves about Shakespeare as a shared space within which one can reconcile what one leaves behind and what one finds here as a migrant coming to this country. When Arne, Denton and Tonderai moved to this country, they found Shakespeare. And since then, actually, they had found Shakespeare earlier, but they found him again, or it again. And since then, they've been inflecting Shakespeare, taking different critical perspectives and different theatrical conventions to it. And it is primarily the acoustic diversity of their voices that the framing device highlights as profoundly controversial, and what I find most interesting. As you've just heard, Denton and Tonderai start speaking in English to their audience because they're mostly whites. The switch to English prompts Denton to claim that he speaks proper English, that he speaks Shakespearean English. Tonderai's cutting remarks, no, you don't. No, Shakespeare was not your grandfather. In turn, provoke Denton to retort, I'll show you. And the result of Denton's challenge was a fantastic production where Shakespeare's English, or the King's English, or King's English, jostled for attention with songs and short lines in Shona, and playfully highlighted the creative tension that a close encounter between Shakespeare and other languages inevitably generates. I therefore want to end my talk by celebrating the fact that the World Service gave this company a platform ensuring that their extraordinary work with Shakespeare could be heard by the large international audiences who tuned in to listen. Ideally, I would have liked to hear them speak Shakespeare's lines, and not only their views about what doing Shakespeare in English, but in the Zimbabwean way, might entail. But the sheer fact that they were invited to speak on the Strand is a testament to the great productive and thought-provoking work that the World Service has done with Shakespeare from its very inception. It is therefore with great respect and gratitude that I salute the World Service vision for a Shakespeare that even while taken to embody the gold standard of English and Englishness, is also represented to worldwide audiences as a key cultural space within which different voices can and do come together to redefine that standard. And it is even with greater respect and gratitude that I'm going to end by asking the very same Tonderai you just heard in my recording to come up and deliver a few lines for us to remedy that horrendous omission on the Strand program that you just heard. So a few lines by Shakespeare, but done in the Zimbabwean way.
So this is the prologue to Two Gentlemen of Verona, but it sounds like something else. And I thought that I would do it in English. And then when we did it at the Globe in 2012, we had to do a Shona version. So I'll give it in English and in Shona.
Yeah,
is that okay?
Perfect.
Because you want English, don't you? Yeah.
And Shona.
And Shona. Okay. The Shona is slightly improvised because we always wanted to be in the moment when we did it. Two best friends, both alike in dignity. Vakomana vaviri vakafana nasemabanzi. In fair Zimbabwe, where we lay our sin, kunoku Zimbabwe kwatikuita mtambo wenu. From rural Verona to busy Milan break forth. Vachiva kumusha kunonzi Verona, vachenda kudoroba rinonzi Milan, vakaenda. One of these friends, called Valentine, sets out. Mumwe mukomana wacho nawo chidafu anonzi Valentine, akaenda. But Proteus, and finds true love with Sylvia in Milan. Akaenda akaona musikana akanaka stereka anonzi Sylvia ku Milan. But Proteus, for he loves a girl called Julia, but Proteus, nekuti anoda musikana anonzi Julia, remains at home to force it by his father. Akasara kumba kusvika adzingwa na baba vake, is made to bid farewell to home and love. Akasiya kumusha nemusikana wake. This Protean story of a turn from love, nyaya ya Proteus neupombwe wake, and the ensuing plight of Julia, nekutambudzika kwa Julia of Sylvia and her troubled Valentine, na Sylvia na Valentine wake, shall, with the cunning manner of our craft, ndizo zvatitaita nas nemtambo wedu, now be the evening's traffic of our stage. Zvachitaita pano pamunge machitarisa makationa. The which, if you allow it to be told, imimi karamati ngazvitaurwe, shall now before your very eyes unfold. Ndizo zvamuchaona nasi pano.
Thank you.
Well, it seems to me there's no following Sonia and Tonderai. And it's Sonia's preference that she entertain questions and feedback much more informally at the reception. So my words will be very brief, I promise you. It struck me when I was talking to Sonia about her presentation that at least since the 1980s, critical Shakespeare studies has been invested in interrogating and unmaking our interpretive assumptions, and how much that has produced what we might call intersectional Shakespeare. But as Sonia has just shown us so powerfully, accent has not come into that conversation in ways that perhaps we might have expected it to. And perhaps that accent remains as an embedded prejudice or preference that we haven't, whether in performance or in our reading aloud of text, that we haven't quite engaged in ways that we indeed should have. It struck me that when I was an undergraduate in the 1970s, I had the good fortune to be fed a pretty steady diet of so-called radical or experimental Shakespeare, but that so much of that was cast in the visual register, and that accent or sound really didn't much enter into those stage performances that I saw. Where I do remember being challenged completely about accent and sound and Shakespeare was in Derek Jarman's film, The Tempest, which I saw, I think, in my second year as a university student. And it blew me away, because this was the thing that pushed at how I heard Shakespeare. So as we are about to go upstairs to chapters for the reception, let me leave you with a talking point to say, how did you first hear Shakespeare, and how do you hear him now? Sonia, thank you for a lovely lecture.